Hello and welcome to this video tutorial on how to play CTM the card game. I am BSM, the creator of said game. We're going to be going through and looking at all the different things, how to set up the game, how to play the game, how to do combat. CTM the card game is a cooperative game for ideally between 4 and 8 players, though it can really work with any number of players, as low as 1, as high as about 10. That the table here is set up for sits, so if you want to play with more, you're going to have to do some tweaking around and shuffling of things around. First thing to do before we begin playing is to set up the game. If you haven't read through the rules cards, you should probably do that. You can make them a little bit bigger for easier reading. And if this is your first game, I would also recommend putting them all over here. Flipping them all over, so they're all over here, for you to refer to as and when you need. Like so. The last 3 cards in this deck refer solely to the boss battles, so you don't really have to refer to that until you get to that point, which is right at the end of the game. Most of the setup is already done for you. In case you need to set up any more player inventories though, each player should have an inventory. You should begin with 20 health points over here, a beginner's sword, which come from this bag over here if you need more of them, 2 health potions, which come from this bag over here, and the beginner's sword should begin with its full 40 durability, which is this number right here, on that counter right there. Map deck should be here, the event deck should be here, all of that stuff should be done for you. To begin, we also need to drag over the green loot deck, spin that around and put that down there. The green mob deck, spin that around and put that down there. And give all of these things a shuffle. Shuffly shuffly. Apparently I just took 1 card and not the whole deck. That would be helpful. Come on, rest of the deck. Shuffly shuffly. Once all those are shuffled in, the final thing to do to set up the deck is to shuffle in the objective. Green wall here. In order to do that, we split the map deck into 4 stacks. The top one of these stacks should be 8, and the rest of them should be 9. Flip this over, so put it on top of the stack of 8 here, and then put these remaining 3 stacks of 9 on top. So a quarter of the deck should be beneath the objective card, and the other 3 quarters should be on top. The game is now set up, and you are ready to begin playing. The game is broken up into 3 sections: the green decks, the red decks, and the black decks, which you'll always play in that order. The objective in each set of decks is to get through the entirety of the map deck until you reach the objective, at which point you can either stop and move on to the next colour, or continue playing through the rest of the cards in the deck. To begin, drag your first card off of the map deck, turn it over, plonk it on the discard pile. Depending on which card you draw, and there are 3, event, chest, and spawner, you will interact with the other 3 decks we have here. In the case of drawing event off the top, we take a card from the event deck and do what it says. There are a variety of different events in the deck. Some of them involve rolling dice and doing various things based on that. Some of them, like this one, involve taking other event cards and doing things with those. And some of them involve interacting with various player inventories in some way, discarding items that you don't need in order to get benefits, discarding, gaining arrows, HP, and other miscellaneous things. Second kind of card that can come off of the map deck is the chest. In this case, you would draw enough items off of the loot deck for every player to have 1 and an extra one. So in the case of 6 players, you would draw 7 off of the loot deck like this. Everybody can take 1 of these items. In this case, we've ended up with a whole bunch of weapons, it looks like. And then once everybody has taken one, there will be one left over, which gets moved into the loot discard pile, like so. The final and most complicated kind of card to be found in the map deck is the spawner. This is similar to the loot deck in that you'll be drawing cards off of the mob deck, this time equal to the number of players without the added +1. So in this case, if there were 6 players, we would draw 6 cards from the mob deck. Every player then chooses which one of these cards they want to take, and combat begins one-on-one with a player and one of these cards. Combat in this game, with the exception of the boss, whom I will cover later, always takes place one-on-one, with each player facing off against one mob. This means that battles can happen without a player needing to care about what any of the other players are doing, and you don't have to synchronize attack turns and enemy attack turns or anything like that, which means that a battle can go more at your own pace that you're comfortable with. Combat will begin after you have drawn a spawner, decided which one of the drawn mobs that you want to engage in combat with, and taken said card over and placed it above your player inventory. First thing to do is then set the mob HP. Mob HP should begin at this left-hand number here, so we want to set this to 20 to begin with. And the next thing we want to do is begin with our player's turn. So, on your turn, you can choose any of the weapons in your inventory to attack with, or you can do an unarmed attack, which does 4 damage. This may be preferable. If you have less than 5 HP left on the mob, and you just want to finish it off without wasting any more weapon durability. So, in order to attack, let's use our beginner's sword here. This does 2G plus B damage. This means that we need to roll 2 green dice and 1 blue dice. Each dice is represented by the first letter of its colour. So 2 greens and 1 blue. So for our first turn, we're going to roll them, and it looks like we're doing 6 damage. Let's subtract 1 from our weapon's durability here, because we've used it, and we'll subtract 6 here from this mob's HP. Next, it's the mob's turn. Always pay attention to any abilities the mob has. And the mob does 3B damage with its attack, so let's take a couple more blue dice from over here. And let's roll all 3 of these. Right, in this case the skeleton has done 3 damage, so we would subtract our own HP by 3. The battle ends when either the opposing mob's HP hits 0, or the player's HP hits 0, in which case the player is knocked out of the game. Let's go in and roll through this entire battle here, so let's roll again with our beginner's sword. That's another 6 damage. And now it's the mob's turn again. Skeleton does have projectile attacks here. Some armor and offhand items will reduce the damage from projectile attacks. We don't have any of those at the moment though. Now for our next turn, just for a little bit of variation, let's try and use the hatchet here. Should have taken that by down for our previous sword attack. Hatchet does 1p plus 4 damage, so let's take our 1 purple dice here. Roll that one. 3 plus 4 is 7. We've not quite dealt with the mob on this turn, but we're almost there. Now, the skeleton can attack one final time, doing a measly 1 damage. Now for our final turn, we could use the sword or the hatchet again. However, we could also just do an unarmed attack for 4 damage, which is enough to reduce the mob's HP to 0. To clean up after our battle, move the defeated mob and place it in the discard mob deck. when all players have defeated their own mobs. You can then keep going and draw the next card from the map deck. Here's a battle scenario where we have a few more things in our inventory to manage. This time we also have a basic bow. We can choose to use this. All items of type bow generally consume arrows upon use. If you don't have any arrows in your arrow counter here, you can't use the weapon. In this case, we can use our basic bow. We would deduct 1 from its durability, deduct 1 arrow, and do a pure 8 damage. Lovely. Skeletons' attacks count as projectiles, as does our own basic bow over here. Some kinds of armor, abilities, and shields in particular are affected by projectile attacks. So in this case, if we roll these 3, the skeleton would do 3 damage. However, we have our shield here. Shield can negate incoming damage from projectiles like the skeletons, or self-destruct abilities like those a creeper have. So instead of taking the HP damage, we can instead choose to take 3 shield durability. Or, alternatively, we can take the HP damage, but we also have some padded armor here, which will reduce the damage that we take. In this case, our light armor would reduce all incoming damage by 1, so it does 2 damage. And we also have some projectile protection here, which further reduces incoming damage that's of projectile type. So, the archer has a projectile attack, so in this case, if we did choose to take the HP loss, we would only actually take 1 damage. A couple of final points here at item discarding. Whenever you discard an item, whether it be in combat due to an item breaking, or as part of an event. Let's do our 1p plus 4 damage here. That's 10. And this weapon is now broken. The item goes back in the deck where it came from. If the loot deck is still the one actively being used, then it goes in the discard pile. If we were playing the red deck at this point, and this was still our green loot deck card, it would go back on top of the green loot deck that would be over here. Additionally, if we choose for our HP to take this hit, 1, and that breaks our armor, this goes back over here. In the middle of combat, you are not allowed to change your armor slot or offhand slot item. However, if an item in either of these slots breaks in the middle of combat, then an exception to that rule is made, and you can bring in any armor or offhand item from the rest of your inventory and move that over. Don't forget to adjust your durability counters whenever you move items within the inventory. I recommend not moving things around too much, so that you don't have to worry about changing numbered counters all the time. In the case of the event deck, mob deck, or loot deck ever run out of cards and you still need more, simply shuffle the cards in that discard pile and move them back over to the draw pile, and then keep going. The exception is the map deck. If the map deck runs out of cards, then you just move on, take the next coloured set of cards and go from there. So we have our objective now. Turn that over and place that anywhere else on the table. Now that we have our objective, we can either move straight along to the next coloured set, or we can keep going through the remaining 7 cards in the map deck. At any time after this where we want to stop, for example if we don't want to bother engaging with this spawner at all, we can stop, fire out the rest of the map deck, and put it back here. Now we need to move on to the next set of coloured cards. So let's take that, put that back there, that, put that back there, and move our previous mob deck and loot deck back along. like so. And now that we've completed green, we can move on to red. Put that there, and shuffle our objective into the map deck in the same way as we did for green. So split this into 4. There's our stack of 8. 3 stacks of 9 on top. That goes there. Ensure that everything else is nice and shuffled. And we can keep going with this new map deck. The setup for the black deck is ever so slightly different. Again, we'll move our loot deck over, we'll move our mob deck over, but this time instead of shuffling the objective into the map deck, like we would do with the green or red decks, we simply put the objective right on the bottom. The final element of the game is the boss battle. This happens right at the end of the game, as you have reached the objective for the final deck, the black, and get the black wool. At this point, the whole thing to do is draw our boss and fight it. If you win against the boss, congratulations, you've beaten the game. So, first thing to do is shuffle our boss deck over here, and to draw one boss off the top. Looks like we have drawn the Curator. Let's place this card in the middle of the table, over here. Let's also make it just a little bit larger. Cool. Let's also bring over all of these counters over here. This one is the boss HP. This goes over here. And these will count any cooldown timers on abilities. Looks like this particular boss only has one ability that uses cooldowns, which is sits, so let's put that one over here by that, so that we can keep track of that as and when we need to. Unlike other mobs, the boss has no attack stat, it has a HP stat, and the amount of HP the boss begins with depends on, again, how many people are playing the game. X here is the number of players, so in the case of a 6-player game, this would be 100 times 6, the boss would start with 600 health. If there were only 4 players, this would be 400. If this were a 10-player game, the boss would begin with 1000 health. Again, players begin with their first turn, so each player chooses a weapon to use, rolls the dice for the weapon that they want to use, and does that much damage. So if there were 6 people, all of us would be rolling for our weapons here and doing that much damage. 5 plus whatever this player rolled, that player, that player, that player. Let's just take this a fair bit down to represent that everybody has rolled their weapon damage against the boss. Now it's the boss's turn. They do not have an attack stat. Instead, to determine what to do, the boss begins by rolling a purple dice, which is a regular d6. Let's give this a roll. We rolled a 5. This means that the boss is going to do the ability next to the number 5 over here. If you rolled a 1, it would do this, 2, that, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So in this case, the player is going to do 2 yellow dice worth of damage to all players, which is a projectile attack, therefore can be slightly easily countered by shields and similar things. In the case of abilities that contain an X, it's the same as the health. This depends on how many players there are. So if we had 6 players, Obliteration Beam here would do damage to 6 out of 6 targeted players. This is a fraction, so this is 1. One player would be targeted by this attack. If there were 8 players, this would be 8 out of 6, which would be 1 and 2/6. This is always rounded up, so that would target 2 players in the case of this playing an 8-player game. If people get knocked out in the middle of the battle, then the X would go down correspondingly, so if the boss managed to kill 3 players in our 6-player game, this would be 3/6, which still gets rounded up to 1. In order to determine which players are targeted, in the case of abilities that involve targeted players, we need our player indicator deck from over here. There are 2 copies of this. The game should begin with each player being assigned one of them. For the rest of the game, this is really just serves as a helpful reminder as to which player's board is whose. It only actually comes into play at all at the very end for the boss here. So, let's flip this over, give this a shuffle, and in the case of our 6-player game with only 1 player being targeted, we would draw 1 off the top here. Should have taken the unused numbers out of the deck first, ideally, but it's fine, we got a number that does actually exist. So it looks like player 3 would be targeted by this attack, and would take 4 damage. The final thing that some bosses do, which is different from the norm, is draw from the mob deck. There are a couple of bosses that have an ability along these lines. In this case, for our 6-player game, this will target 6 out of 4, which is 1.5, which rounds up to 2. And players will now need to decide who is going to face these mobs. Say, for example, our player 2 and our player 3 here are going to deal with these. They would then begin by setting up their combat, blah da 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 da, and continue doing a regular 1 versus 1 combat as you would expect with this mob here. While that is happening, let's actually take the numbers that are currently unused in our 6-player game out of this deck. There we go. We do not currently need these. Let's give that a good shuffle. Right. While players are fighting their respective mobs in combat, they are immune from targeted attacks. So in our example here, we will be taking the 2 and 3 out of this player indicator deck for the duration. Once the player has defeated the mob that they are dealing with and rejoined the main battle, then their numbered card would be re-added into the indicator deck here. Players are still affected by attacks that deal damage to all players. For example, our attack number 5 over here that does damage to all players will also deal damage to players having their own battles over here. This is also the only case where you do need to actually synchronize attack turns happening in individual battles with the main fight, so that things don't get out of sync. Once the boss's HP hits 0, congratulations, you've beaten the game. I hope that you enjoyed playing through the game, or being about to play through the game. I hope that you do enjoy. Send any feedback my way on either Steam or Discord. Thank you for playing. I hope you have fun.